Like always, I came home from work expecting nothing out of the ordinary. My days follow a familiar rhythm: clock out, drive home, and find my wife handling things around the house. That's just how we do things. But something felt different that evening. The moment I stepped inside, I was met with the sound of her voice, lively and full of energy, mixed with the unmistakable chatter of her friends. This wasn't the usual low hum of casual conversation in the background. They were deep in it, voices overlapping, excitement buzzing in the air. After kicking off my shoes and rinsing my hands, I followed the noise into the living room. They were all crammed together on the couch, laughing, talking over each other, like kids caught up in some juicy gossip session at recess. I'm not one to butt into my wife's social time, but curiosity won out. I grabbed a cup of coffee, sank into my usual chair, and tuned in. Honestly, sometimes their conversations were more entertaining than whatever action flick I'd usually have on after work. From what I could gather, they were reminiscing about their younger years, late nights, wild parties, spontaneous road trips. The kind of carefree adventures that now felt like they belonged to another lifetime. One of them, clearly caught up in the nostalgia, suggested they relive one of those nights. My wife and the others were all for it, tossing around ideas for a laid-back get-together, maybe at someone's house or a night out at a local bar. It all sounded pretty harmless. I kept sipping my coffee, amused by just how much enthusiasm they had for this sudden plan. Then, out of nowhere, my wife's friend Sara threw a curveball into the conversation. Leaning in, she lowered her voice like she was about to spill some big secret. "What if we made it special?" she said, her tone full of suggestion. At first, no one seemed to get where she was going. Then she smirked, like she was letting them in on some inside joke. "You know, like a swinger party." I damn near choked on my coffee. For a split second, silence settled over the room, just long enough for the shock to register, before it burst into laughter. My wife and her friends glanced at each other, eyes wide, giggles bubbling up like teenagers hearing something scandalous for the first time. Meanwhile, Sara carried on like she was suggesting nothing more than a themed game night. She made sure to reassure everyone that it didn't have to be anything crazy, people could stick with their own partners if they wanted. "Just an idea," she shrugged. "Something fun. Something different." The group kept laughing, tossing around playful what-ifs without really committing to the idea. Someone jokingly suggested they ease into things with a regular bar night before even thinking about something that bold. That seemed to take some of the edge off the conversation. No one outright rejected Sara's proposal, but no one was rushing to make it happen either. My wife, always the level-headed one, stepped in to keep things from spiraling. "Let's start with a normal girls' night first," she suggested, and the others quickly agreed. They switched gears to discussing which bar had the best drinks, the best music, the best vibe. As I sat back, quietly soaking it all in, it felt like I was watching some unscripted reality show unfold right in my own living room. By the time they wrapped things up, the mood was light, full of laughter and the easy comfort of old friends reconnecting. It was obvious that Sara's idea wasn't going anywhere, at least, not anytime soon. The focus was back on something simple: a night out, some drinks, and a chance to cut loose for a bit. And as far as I was concerned, that was exactly where it needed to stay. Once everyone had cleared out, we headed straight to bed. After a long day at work, I was completely drained, and with a day off ahead of me, all I wanted was a solid night's sleep. The house had finally settled into a comfortable quiet, the kind that let the exhaustion really sink in. I barely had to pull the covers over me before I felt myself slipping into sleep. But, of course, just as I was drifting off, my wife nudged me awake. "Hey, can I ask you something?" Her voice cut through the fog of my half-conscious state. I cracked one eye open, struggling to focus. "What now?" I grumbled, not exactly thrilled to be dragged back to reality. She ignored my tone, clearly intent on whatever was on her mind. "What do you think about what Sara said?" she asked. It took me a second to catch up, but then the memory of Sara's wild suggestion from earlier that evening flashed through my mind, the swinger party idea. My first instinct was to shut it down immediately, but I figured I'd at least hear her out. After a pause, I sighed. Honestly, I'm not really into the whole partner swapping thing. Just not my style. If it's just the two of us, maybe I'd consider it, but beyond that, I shook my head. Not for me. She didn't say anything right away, and for a moment, I thought the conversation might be over. But then she spoke again. "Doesn't it bother you, though? You know, the idea of being around other people in that kind of situation?" Her voice wasn't accusatory, just curious. I let out a chuckle. "Are you serious?" I said. "The guys in the locker room have seen me naked more times than you have. Pretty sure there's nothing left for me to be self-conscious about." She rolled her eyes at that, but I caught the faintest twitch of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "You're impossible," she muttered, turning onto her side. She didn't push the issue any further, which was a relief. The last thing I wanted was to spend my night off debating something I had zero interest in. As she settled in, she let out a small sigh and mumbled almost as an afterthought, "Well, good night. I'll drop it for now." There was a hint of amusement in her tone, but nothing more. "Good night," I replied, shutting my eyes and hoping that would be the last interruption. Within moments, I heard her breathing slow as she drifted off. And just like that, the conversation was done, at least for now. The next morning, over breakfast, she blindsided me. "I've been thinking," she said, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee. "Maybe I should actually organize that thing Sara mentioned, you know, the party." I set my fork down, giving her a long, careful look. It wasn't unusual for her to get wrapped up in new ideas, but this one caught me completely off guard. Before I could say a word, she kept going. "I'm meeting up with Sara today to talk it over. Sara's boyfriend will be there too," she added, as if that was supposed to put me at ease. Instead, it did the exact opposite. The thought of some guy I barely knew, especially one I'd only heard questionable stories about, being involved in this whole thing made me uneasy. My wife must have noticed the look on my face because she quickly added, "Don't worry, I'll keep you updated. But I know you'll probably want to check things out for yourself." "Damn right, I will," I muttered, pushing my plate away. It wasn't just the idea of unfamiliar people being involved that bothered me. The thought of hosting something like this in our own home? That was a hard no. First rule of throwing parties: never host one unless you're fully prepared to deal with the mess afterward. And this wasn't just any party. By the time she left, my mind was already running through a mental checklist of things I'd need to keep an eye on if this insane idea actually went forward. A few hours later, she came back looking a little flushed, and not just from excitement. The faint scent of wine lingered in the air as she walked in, telling me she'd been drinking. "It's coming together," she announced, dropping her purse onto the counter. "But we'll need more time to plan everything properly." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to elaborate. "Sara's boyfriend is on board," she continued, grinning. "And get this, he owns a sex shop. He said he could hook us up with, supplies." That last word just hung there, and I couldn't help but laugh at how casually she said it, like she was talking about napkins and party favors instead of whatever it was she meant. She went on to share some of the exciting news from their little meeting. Apparently, Sara's boyfriend had even pulled out some of his merchandise to show them. "He brought out these giant toys," she said, cracking up. "I have no idea who actually buys them, but they're hilarious. We should get one, just as a joke." The thought of it was so ridiculous, I found myself laughing along with her. "Yeah, sure," I said, shaking my head. "But I'll tell you right now, if you do, that thing's never seeing daylight. Straight to the back of the closet. That sent her into another fit of laughter, and for a moment, the tension around this whole situation eased. A few days later, she came to me with yet another idea. "We need to have a barbecue," she declared, as if it was the most logical next step in all of this. I gave her a look, waiting for her to explain. "We can invite everyone over and finalize the party plans," she said. "Sara and I talked about it, and this seems like the best way to get everyone on board." I wasn't exactly convinced. "It's not like we haven't had plenty of chances to gather people already," I pointed out. "You've been running around with this idea for days now. Why not just set a date and make it happen? Do we really need to throw a whole barbecue for this?" She smiled, brushing off my skepticism. "It's our first time doing something like this. I want it to be perfect." Reluctantly, I gave in. I pulled out the grill, made a run to the butcher for some good cuts, and spent the afternoon setting up in the backyard. By the time the first guests arrived, everything was in place. As people settled in, I spotted Sara's boyfriend for the first time. Hard to miss, really, covered in tattoos, piercings in places I wasn't even sure could be pierced, and eyes that had a wild, almost predatory edge to them. For the most part, the barbecue went smoothly. People ate, laughed, mingled. But it didn't take long for something about Sara's boyfriend to stand out. While everyone else mixed and chatted as a group, he had a different approach. He moved from woman to woman, leaning in close, laughing just a little too much, talking in a way that felt off. It rubbed me the wrong way, so I decided to ask Sara about it. "Doesn't it bother you how he's acting?" I asked. She shrugged. "I'm not the jealous type," she said, completely unfazed. "He's just being friendly." "If you say so," I replied, though I wasn't convinced. As I turned to walk away, I noticed my wife deep in conversation with him. They were laughing about something, and I felt an immediate twinge of irritation. I made my way over, just in time to catch part of what they were joking about, the oversized toys Sara's boyfriend had shown them earlier. "Can you even imagine?" my wife said, still laughing. Not wanting to make a scene, I casually inserted myself into the conversation, shifting it in another direction. It was subtle, but I caught the flicker of annoyance on his face. He didn't linger much longer after that, which was just fine by me. Later, after everyone had eaten, my wife stood up and got everyone's attention. She stood up and laid out her vision for the party, breaking it down for everyone. "It's totally up to you how you want to handle it," she said. "Stick with your partner, or don't. Bring friends along if you want. The whole point is to have fun." Most of the group seemed on board. Our house was big enough to handle a crowd, and the idea of doing something a little unconventional clearly intrigued them. But as I stood there, listening to the conversation unfold and watching the excitement build, something just didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just the thought of the logistics or the inevitable mess afterward, it was the principle of the whole thing. Still, I kept my concerns to myself. The ball was already rolling, and stopping it now didn't seem like an option. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, the house finally settled into an uneasy quiet. I finished up the last of the dishes while my wife lounged on the couch, scrolling through her phone. As I stood there, drying my hands, all the thoughts that had been running through my head since the barbecue finally spilled out. "You know," I started, leaning against the counter, "I don't see how Sara's relationship is going to last. Did you notice the way her boyfriend was acting tonight? He wasn't just making conversation, he was straight up flirting. And not just with the other women. With you, too." She glanced up at me, surprised. "What are you talking about?" she asked, setting her phone aside. "He's just being friendly." I let out a scoff. "Friendly? Come on. The way he was zoning in on you, laughing, touching your arm, that wasn't just friendly. He's testing limits. And if Sara doesn't see it, she's blind. But you saw it, didn't you?" She hesitated for a second, then sighed. I guess I can see how it might look that way. But it's not really my place to say anything. Besides, Sara's happy. She's not trying to get serious with him. That casual dismissal only irritated me more. Not serious? I repeated. She's dating a guy who openly flirts with other women right in front of her, and she's fine with that? And what about you? Doesn't it bother you that he was coming on to you? Relax, she said, waving it off like I was making a big deal out of nothing. It's not what you think. Sara knows exactly what she's doing. She told me herself, she's only with him for the sex and the money he makes from his shop. That's all she wants. I just stared at her, trying to process what I'd just heard. You're serious? She nodded. That's what she said. She's into open relationships, and apparently, he's on the same page. It works for them. I shook my head. That's not a relationship. That's a transaction. I looked at her, searching for some kind of reaction. And you're just, okay with this? She gave a little shrug. It's not my business. They're both adults. They've made their choices. Who are we to judge? I exhaled sharply, my frustration bubbling over. I'll tell you who I am, I'm the guy who has to sit here and watch this circus unfold. If Sara wants to mess around with her life, that's on her. But I don't want her chaos spilling over into ours. And I damn sure don't want her boyfriend hanging around here if he's gonna act like that. She sighed, clearly getting tired of the conversation. Look, I get it. You don't like him. But this isn't about us. Sara knows what she's doing, and she's happy. Let's just focus on our own lives, okay? It was hard to argue with that, even if I wasn't convinced. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this whole situation was off. Sara might think she had things under control, but her boyfriend's behavior told a different story. I didn't trust him, and I definitely didn't like how comfortable he seemed around my wife. But for now, I let it go. There was no point in pushing the issue any further tonight. As our conversation wound down, my wife glanced at the clock and stretched. We've got an early start tomorrow, she said, getting to her feet. I've got a few errands to run in the city, and I want to knock them out first thing. I nodded, relieved for the change in subject. There'd be plenty of time to revisit this later, but for now, it was best to let it rest. Sleep sounded like the better option. The next morning. Even after a full night's rest, I couldn't shake the unease from our conversation. Over breakfast, I watched my wife move around the kitchen, checking her phone and grabbing her bag, clearly preoccupied with something. Where are you off to? I asked, keeping my tone casual. She barely looked up as she slipped on her shoes. Oh, Sara's not feeling great, too much cold beer, probably. I'm going to meet her boyfriend to pick up some supplies for the party. That stopped me cold. You're going with him? I asked, working to keep my irritation in check. She nodded, her hand already on the doorknob. Yeah, he's giving us a bunch of stuff for free, so it'll save us some money. Plus, he's got some interesting things we might even want to try ourselves, she added with a playful wink. I opened my mouth to object, but before I could get a word in, she was already heading out. Don't worry, I'll be back soon, she called over her shoulder as the door shut behind her. I stood there for a long moment, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. The idea of her being alone with that guy didn't sit right with me, but what could I do? She was already gone. I sank onto the couch, pulling out my phone in an attempt to distract myself. As I scrolled through messages, I noticed our group chat lighting up. Curious, I opened it and saw the conversation was about none other than Sara's boyfriend, the same guy my wife was now alone with. Anyone else notice how Sara's boyfriend acts around women? One of my buddies wrote. He's way too friendly for my liking. Another message popped up right after. You're not imagining it. I caught him flirting with my wife at the barbecue. She told me he even messaged her afterward. I shut that down real quick. My stomach twisted as I kept reading. It wasn't just me who had noticed something off. This guy had a pattern. And it wasn't harmless. More messages came in. One friend mentioned how he'd seen the guy deliberately isolating women at gatherings, always finding ways to get them alone. Another added that his wife described him as charming but creepy, which, based on what I'd seen, seemed to be a fitting description. Then came the message that made my blood run cold. I caught my wife texting him, someone admitted. Nothing too crazy, but it was enough for me to put a stop to it. I told her he's off limits. That hit too close to home. The idea of my wife spending time alone with this guy, let alone texting him, sent a wave of anger through me. This wasn't about jealousy or paranoia. This guy was a problem, and it wasn't just in my head. If he was bold enough to make moves on other men's wives, what was stopping him from trying the same thing with mine? The more I thought about it, the more certain I became, this needed to be dealt with before it got out of hand. By the time my wife walked back through the door, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. I wasn't going to let this slide. That guy needed to stay far away from her, and I was going to make sure of it, whatever it took. I wasn't about to let some sleazy, overconfident bastard put my marriage or my peace of mind at risk. That evening, my wife walked through the door, a massive box of condoms in her arms. I just stood there, completely dumbfounded, as she set it down on the kitchen table with a satisfied grin. Before I could even process that, Sarah's boyfriend strolled in right behind her, carrying another, smaller bag. He nodded at me like we were old pals, setting the bag down casually. Just thought I'd help out, he said, smirking before turning back to my wife. Let me know if you need anything else. I watched him closely as he lingered a little longer than necessary, like he was waiting for an invitation to stay. Finally, he glanced my way and flashed a smile. Nice seeing you again, he said smoothly before heading for the door. I didn't bother responding. The only reason I didn't slam the door behind him was that I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing he was getting under my skin. Meanwhile, my wife hummed to herself as she started unpacking the box, completely oblivious to the frustration boiling inside me. Close the door, I said, my voice firm. She paused mid-motion, turning to me with a mix of surprise and irritation. What? Close the door, I repeated, this time leaving no room for argument. We need to talk. With an exasperated sigh, she complied, shutting the door and folding her arms. What now? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my tone measured. It's about him, I said, nodding toward the door. I've been watching him, and I'm not the only one. He's not just being friendly, he's crossing lines. One of my friends caught his wife texting him. This guy has a pattern, and I don't trust him. And frankly, I don't think you should either. She frowned, shaking her head. You're blowing this way out of proportion, she said. He's just helping with the party. That's all. I scoffed. Helping? That's what you're calling it? The guy's been making moves on multiple women, including you, right under everyone's noses. And I'm done playing along. No more private interactions with him. If you need something, you go through Sara, or she's there when it happens. Period. Her eyes widened in disbelief. You can't be serious, she said, her voice rising. He's been a huge help, and now you're trying to sabotage everything? Do you even hear yourself? You sound like a control freak. I didn't flinch. Call it whatever you want, I said. But if you think I'm just going to sit back while that guy hovers around you, you're wrong. And if you really believe I'm overreacting, let me put it in simpler terms, either you cut off the private interactions, or my friends and I will handle it a different way. And trust me, you're not going to like how that plays out. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue but couldn't quite find the words. Finally, she shook her head. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered. "This is just your ego talking." I folded my arms, standing my ground. "Think whatever you want," I said, "but this is the best solution for everyone. You're almost done planning this party anyway. Cutting him off isn't going to ruin anything." She let out a heavy sigh, clearly irritated, but I could see her wheels turning. After a long pause, she finally muttered, "Fine. I'll do it your way. But you're making this way harder than it needs to be." I nodded, satisfied. "Good. That's all I'm asking." She turned away, still muttering under her breath as she went back to unpacking the box, her annoyance practically radiating off her. But for now, the issue was settled, even if she wasn't happy about it. The day of the party. From the moment I woke up, it was clear that today was going to be hectic. My wife was running around, making sure every little detail was perfect, while I did my best to stay out of the way. Everything seemed to be under control, until my phone rang. It was work. An emergency had come up, and they needed me in. Immediately, frustrated but without much of a choice, I grabbed my keys and told my wife I'd be back as soon as I could. As I stepped out the door, I pulled out my phone and shot a quick message to the group chat. "Keep an eye on Sarah's boyfriend tonight. You all know why." The replies came almost instantly. "We've got it," one of them confirmed. It gave me a little reassurance, but not nearly enough. Even as I drove to work, something about leaving felt wrong. Luckily, the issue at work didn't take as long as I expected. Before I knew it, I was back on the road, heading home. For the first time all day, I started to relax. Maybe I'd overthought the whole thing. Maybe everything was fine. But just as I was pulling into the neighborhood, my phone buzzed with a new message. "Hey, has anyone seen your wife? She's not around." My stomach dropped. I quickly typed back, "What do you mean? Isn't she at the party?" The response came almost immediately. "No one's seen her for a while." By the time I pulled into the driveway, my nerves were on edge. The party was still in full swing, music blaring, people scattered across the house and backyard, drinks in hand, laughter cutting through the night air. But as I stepped inside, scanning the crowd, I didn't see her. A few people nodded in greeting, but I barely acknowledged them. Something was off. I made my way toward the kitchen, where I finally spotted Sara standing near the counter, drink in hand. She looked up as I approached, her face neutral, until I asked the question. "Where's your boyfriend?" Her expression shifted to confusion. She shrugged. "I don't know. He was here earlier." She took a sip of her drink, then gave me a curious look. "Why?" I stared at her. "Because my wife is missing too." That got her attention. She immediately set her drink down, her eyes widening. "She was here," she said quickly. "I saw her talking to some people not long ago." But something in her tone, hesitation, uncertainty, made my stomach twist. I stepped back and took another look around the room, hoping I'd just missed her in the crowd. But there was nothing. I turned back to Sara, who was now looking as uneasy as I felt. "Let's go find them," I said. "I've got a bad feeling about this." She hesitated, then nodded, setting her glass aside and falling in step beside me. We started searching the house, moving from room to room, but with each empty space we checked, my gut feeling only got worse. Upstairs, the hallway was eerily quiet, a sharp contrast to the noise still pouring in from downstairs. I pushed open one door after another, calling my wife's name, but all I found were guests who looked confused to see me or empty rooms that only made my unease deepen. Sara stayed close, her own concern growing with every step. After a few minutes, I turned to her. "We need to check outside next." She nodded but cast a quick glance over her shoulder, like she half expected someone to step out of the shadows. "Maybe they're just out back," she suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. We headed downstairs, weaving through the partygoers, but the tension in my chest wouldn't go away. Outside, the backyard was cooler, the night air crisp, but it did nothing to ease my nerves. The patio was mostly empty, aside from a few scattered guests who were either too drunk to notice anything or just wrapped up in their own conversations. None of them had seen my wife. None of them had seen Sarah's boyfriend either. Frustration mounted as I scanned the darkened corners of the yard, hoping, praying, for some sign of her. Sara stayed close, her unease now mirroring mine. "Maybe they went back inside," she suggested weakly. "We should check upstairs again." Back inside, the party noise seemed even louder than before, almost overwhelming. We pushed through the crowd, ignoring the laughter and conversation as we made our way back up the stairs. The hallway was still dim, still empty, but this time, something was different. I stopped. Listened. Faint voices. Coming from a room at the end of the hall. I gave Sara a quick signal, and we moved toward the door cautiously. The closer we got, the clearer the voices became. One sounded panicked, almost pleading, while the other, a woman's voice, was frantic, desperate. My pulse hammered in my ears as I recognized my wife's voice. "No, no, we can't call anyone," she said, her words rushed and shaken. "If my husband finds out, it'll ruin everything." That was all I needed to hear. Without hesitation, I shoved the door open. The sight before me froze me in place. My wife lay on the bed, her face twisted in discomfort, while Sarah's boyfriend loomed over her, fumbling with something. It took half a second to process what I was looking at, an oversized toy in his hands, the sheer absurdity of it doing nothing to dull my fury. He looked up, his face going pale as he stammered, "Man, listen, I can explain." I didn't need to hear a single word. My fist connected with his face before he could finish the sentence, knocking him backward onto the floor. He scrambled to his feet, holding up his hands in a weak attempt to defuse the situation. "It's not what it looks like," he pleaded. I wasn't interested. Sara stood frozen in the doorway, her expression a mix of shock and horror. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, but neither of us answered. I grabbed the bastard by his collar, yanking him to his feet. He kept babbling, but I wasn't listening. "Shut up," I growled, shoving him toward the door. "We're done talking." Pulling out my phone, I fired off a quick message to the group chat, "I need backup. Now." Minutes later, two of my closest friends stormed upstairs. They took one look at the scene and didn't need an explanation. A silent understanding passed between us. We weren't letting this guy walk away unscathed. Using whatever we could find, we restrained him, binding his hands securely as his protests grew louder. He struggled as we dragged him downstairs and out to my car, but it didn't matter. "You're making a mistake," he shouted, his voice laced with panic. I ignored him. Sara followed, still trying to make sense of what had just happened, but I barely acknowledged her. My only focus was getting this guy as far away from my wife as possible. We drove out into the countryside, the car heavy with unspoken rage. The boyfriend's pleas for mercy didn't stop, but none of us responded. The silence from our side was enough to tell him he was in no position to argue. Finally, we reached a deserted stretch of road, thick with trees and darkness. We hauled him out, his hands still tied. Without a word, we got back in the car and left him there, disappearing into the night. Back home. The moment we pulled into the driveway, flashing red and blue lights met us, cutting through the dark. An ambulance. My stomach sank. A cold wave of anger and dread washed over me. The party was all but over. Cars were trickling out, and the once lively atmosphere had been replaced with something else entirely. Guests moved in hushed murmurs, some staring, some pretending they didn't see. Whatever had happened, things had officially spiraled out of control. I threw the car into park and bolted inside. The living room was a disaster, cups and bottles littered every surface, the remnants of a night that had gone completely off the rails. But none of that mattered. I was looking for one person. The medics were in the hallway, speaking in low, professional tones as they packed up their equipment. And then, I saw her. My wife sat on the couch, pale and visibly shaken. The oversized toy lay on the floor beside her, a grotesque symbol of how far this night had fallen. One of the medics approached me, his voice calm and clinical. "We've removed the object," he said matter-of-factly. "She's fine now, but she needs to rest and take it easy for a while." I barely managed a nod. Words felt pointless. They finished their work and left, leaving me alone in a house that now felt colder, emptier than ever. I stood there for a long moment, taking it all in. The wreckage of the night, the silence that filled the house, and my wife sitting there, eyes wide, pleading. But I couldn't find it in me to feel anything close to sympathy. The last few days crashed down on me all at once, and with them came a cold, unwavering certainty. "We need to talk," I said, my voice calm, emotionless. She opened her mouth, probably to offer some excuse, but I wasn't interested. "Don't bother explaining," I cut in. "I've seen enough. This," I gestured around at the mess, at the aftermath of everything that had unfolded. "This is beyond fixing. I'm filing for divorce." The words hit like a hammer, hanging heavy between us. Her face crumpled, and she shook her head, tears already spilling down her cheeks. "Please, don't do this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know it was a mistake, but we can fix it. I'll do whatever it takes." I looked at her, but there was nothing left to feel. Just emptiness. "It's too late," I said simply. "You made your choices. And I've made mine. The papers will be ready soon. Just be prepared." The desperation in her eyes flickered into anger. She shot up from the couch, pacing furiously. "You're really going to throw everything away over one night?" she snapped. "After everything we've been through? Does that mean nothing to you?" I didn't rise to the argument she wanted. I kept my tone steady. "You made it mean nothing the moment you let this happen." She stared at me, hands trembling at her sides, before letting out a sharp breath and storming off to the bedroom. I listened as she yanked open drawers, muttering to herself while she tossed things into a suitcase. Moments later, she reappeared, her jaw set in frustration. "Fine," she spat. "I'll go to my mother's. Maybe she'll actually listen to me." I stepped aside as she dragged her suitcase past me, the wheels grating against the floor. A second later, the front door slammed behind her. Silence. For the first time in days, I felt something close to peace. The decision was made. There was no turning back now. Days later. The aftermath of everything weighed on me, leaving me restless. I couldn't stop replaying it all, the party, the ambulance, the way things had spiraled out of control. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just at my wife, but at Sara's boyfriend. He wasn't just some idiot who crossed a line. He had deliberately pushed boundaries, disrespected people, and turned lives upside down. And he'd walked away without a scratch. That didn't sit right with me. What bothered me most was how easily he had manipulated Sara, how he'd pulled her and others into his twisted games. He thought he could get away with it. I decided he needed a wake-up call. As an electrician, I had a very particular set of skills. Skills that, when used correctly, could send a message, one that wouldn't be ignored. I called Sara, pretending I needed to clarify some things about the aftermath of the party. During the conversation, I casually asked for the address of her boyfriend's store. She rattled it off without a second thought. That was all I needed. That evening, I reached out to a couple of close friends who had been at the party, guys who were just as fed up as I was. Once they heard my plan, they didn't hesitate. We waited until after hours. The night was quiet as we pulled up outside his shop. The place was small, unassuming. But as I stood there, I felt a surge of satisfaction at what was about to happen. With tools in hand, we made our way to the electrical panel at the back of the building. Years of experience made the job almost too easy. We worked fast, tampering with circuits, setting things up just right. Nothing that would be obvious at first. Just a few subtle issues, enough to cause problems. Problems that would start small but grow into something much bigger. This wasn't just about inconvenience. This was about making sure he felt the full weight of what he had done. As we wrapped up, I took one last look at the shop, knowing its days were numbered. A few days later, the news broke. Sarah's boyfriend's store had burned to the ground, completely unsalvageable. According to the report, the fire had been caused by an electrical fault. Hearing that should have made me feel triumphant, but instead, I felt something else. A mix of relief and the heavy realization of how far I had gone. I didn't regret it, not for a second. The man had it coming. But standing there, knowing he had lost everything, I found myself wondering, was it enough? Would it finally force him to take a long, hard look at himself? Not long after, I got a call from Sara. Her voice was quieter than usual, the weight of recent events pressing down on her. I broke up with him, she said. No hesitation, no emotion. Just fact. I exhaled, letting her words settle. After everything that happened, I finally realized how toxic he was, she continued. He manipulated me into thinking his whole idea of open relationships was normal. But it was never about that. It was about control. I wasn't surprised. I'd seen it from the start. He had a way of pulling people into his games, twisting things to make himself look like the good guy. Sara had just been another pawn. You did the right thing, I told her. You deserve better than someone like that. She sighed, but this time, there was a steadiness in her voice. Yeah. It's gonna take time, but at least now I see things for what they are. It was the closest thing to a victory I'd had in a while. The man who had spent so much time manipulating, disrespecting, and destroying had finally been stripped of everything, his business, his relationship, his control. The empire he thought he'd built had crumbled beneath him. And while I knew I couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the chaos he'd caused, I could at least take comfort in the fact that, for once, someone like him had to face the consequences of his own actions. Sara's decision to leave him was the final piece of the puzzle, proof that, in the end, he had failed.